Welcome to another one of our videos, and today I'm going to be talking about the joint by joint approach and how I use it to assist me in finding the sources of injury, pain, and sometimes not injury or pain, just weaknesses and poor performance or poor movement. So let's get into it. So the first thing I'll say about this before we get into it is I do use it quite a lot as a guide, but in no way is it absolutely correct all the time, and in no way it could be. There's always exceptions to the rule, so you have to always keep this in mind and not sort of have an absolute definite yes or no. It just sort of helps to clear up the mess of things. So if you worked in the industry for a while, especially with injury and things like that, you'll know that there is no absolutes. There's always things that don't make sense, and you have to remove biases of prior experience to not go down a cookie cutter approach of treating everyone the same. So there's always contradictory things, and you just got to bear that in mind, right? So that's the first thing I'll say before we get into this. All right, so let's get into it. So what exactly is the joint by joint approach? So in a basic sort of looking at it as an overall sort of summary, what you see is each joint will have on its joint above or below will have a different role to play. So either one thing's going to be stabilizing method to the joint, or it's going to be immobilizing. So more or less all joints need some mobility and all need some stability. But what this is basically saying is that certain joints will have a preference for a higher level of one over the other. Right? So if we started from the feet are primarily concerned with stability, whereas the ankle, being a specific joint designed for multi-directional movement, is more concerned with mobility. And above that is the knee, which is not able to twist and do rotational movements like the ankle can, so it's more of a hinge joint, so it's primarily concerned with stability. And as you can see here, further up you go, the hip is opposite to the knee, so it needs to provide mobility. The lumbar spine is very similar to the knee in that it needs stability. Thoracic spine similar to the hip in that it provides rotational movements, and the way that the spine is designed means it's primarily concerned with mobility. The scapula and the shoulder starts to get really messy because they are pretty much ones that are a bit of both, more than any of the other joints. But if we were to say where most of the issues of the scapula are found, it's usually with stability. The shoulder usually has too much mobility. It means getting it into trouble. Cervical spine, very much concerned with stability, although it does have a fair degree of mobility as well. All right, so as a general rule, this works quite well in helping you to determine what is the best corrective exercises for these specific areas, but even more importantly than that, it's sort of helping you to determine, okay, if I've got a knee problem, maybe it's because I've got a mobility problem at the hip and the ankle that is causing my knee to be in pain. All right, so that's where this can be really clever. By the way, this method is invented by great cook and strength coach Mike Boyle. So, and I think it's a real clever tool to have in your assessment process of, like, sort of thinking about things that you may not suspect. All right, so getting into it, I'm breaking this down more to see how I actually use it. So when you're trying to observe someone moving, right, and you know that they may have a problem, but you don't know why they have a problem, so you have to try and look for clues, things that, like, why is this person continually beating up this joint? There must be something that they're doing. So you have to look at the way that they're doing and the way that the muscles are communicating with themselves, and which are really complicated. So things like throwing a ball or walking, there's so many muscles moving at once, it's hard to determine which one is doing the right thing and which one's doing the wrong thing, because they all happen within milliseconds. So sometimes you can see it going wrong and you can't determine why it's going wrong. So this is where having a better, clearer understanding of what the muscles in the specific joints are meant to do helps you to determine, okay, what the course of action might be. So as we could see before, some muscles are going to create movement by stabilizing and basically preventing a joint from moving too far, where other muscles are going to be trying to enhance movement and to with more mobility so that you can move. All right, so when you consider all these joints doing so many different things firing at the same time, how do you know which one's at fault? How do you know if it's weakness, or how do you know if it's stiffness? All right, so the compensation makes it really messy, because the body's really good at trying to avoid pain and further destruction of joints by creating stiffness and protecting them, which often hides the real problem, which is the weakness. And it makes it real difficult to pinpoint what is causing these problems. So you'll see stiffness is easy to spot, but if it's a byproduct of something else, what is it a byproduct of? Where is it coming from? Where's the original weakness that it's trying to protect itself? So often these weaknesses or the stiffnesses may not be causing the pain. Maybe the person isn't even in pain, but the way that they move is, you're predicting it may be in pain, or they just can't move very freely or with good performance or strength in the movement they have, even though it's not causing pain. You can just tell it's really awkward and inefficient. So these are good examples. That's a terrible deadlifting position. That's a terrible squatting position. There's obviously some stiffness going on in the hips in probably both cases here, but is it because the hips are stiff or the thoracic is rigid, or is there really a weakness at play here? And it most likely is a weakness, but the stiffness is hiding it. All right, so that's an example of, you could be saying, well, maybe it's the ankles that is creating this problem, because in this case, this squat, that's a horrible, there's really lack of dorsiflexion there. So it could be many things, could be all of them. So what you're trying to do to try and make your exercise selection more specific and effective is trying to narrow down your selection to find the ones that are going to create the best influence over what you're trying to change. So especially if it's with pain, you're trying to remove that source of pain as fast as you can. So by having this sort of joint by joint approach, it helps to simplify what can usually be very, very, very messy and complicated. So as I mentioned before, each of the joints have a different role. So they all have some element of both, but as you could see, just the way that they're designed, that they sort of have a preference for one more than the other. So the most important thing to see is that how each joint that's stacked upon the next is an opposing role. So when you understand that, it makes it easier to see the ones that usually end up in pain are usually the ones that need stability. And, so usually the ones that are, so neck pain, shoulder pain, lower back pain, knee pain, plantar fasciitis, Achilles problems, foot pain. All right, so usually the stabilizing ones are the ones that end up in trouble, and usually the mobilizing ones are the ones that end up with stiffness. Ironically, the stabilizing ones usually end up with too much mobility. So basically everything's doing its opposing role, which is kind of strange. But so when you understand what each joint requires, it's easy to connect the dots, and so you can sort of see how one influences the other, and contributing to how it's getting injured or not providing the most efficient way of moving. All right, so the best part is it guides you on what your effective exercises at restoring a problem may be. So there might be several of them that you may need to use, but now that you know which area you want to work in, it makes it a bit easier to find that right one. So before you sort of jump right into it, you really want to be clear on what mobility stability means. So basically mobility means the ability of the joint complex to move freely in an unrestricted manner through a full range of motion. So basically to be able to move that particular segment like without any stiffness or restriction. Stabilizing means the ability of the the joint to maintain its perfect position so it can control the motion, so it's not moving in and out of the socket into terrible alignments that would compromise ligaments and tendons and structures of the joint itself. So this is often referred to as motor control. All right, so now that you've sort of got the understanding of where they are and what stability means, what mobility means, and what each joint is supposed to sort of do, the most important part of all this is really to memorize this part, is when a mobile joint becomes immobile, the stabilizing joint, either above or below it, will sacrifice its stability to provide the movement that you've now lost. All right, so this is a good quote: your brain's too smart to let it have full horsepower in a bad position. This is called muscle inhibition. So muscle inhibition just means like the protective mechanism. So where tight muscle is going to steal the workload of a weakened muscle, and you're always going to have limited range of motion and never be able to have full strength in that position. All right. So now the big question that comes up is, well, how do you know it's always the mobile joint becoming immobile that does this? Well, sometimes it's the weakness that created the stiffness in the first place, but what tends to happen is that the tight muscles just end up taking over, and that's where the tonic and phasic muscle system comes into it. This is a concept from Vladimir Janda, and this is easily observed if you ever see anyone with cerebral palsy or some nervous system problem where the tonic muscles will always go crazy. So any time there's a problem within the nervous system, that's what will happen. So when usually those muscles create flexion. Usually the ones that are creating extension are the ones that really get inhibited and can't fire anymore. All right, so stiffness precedes weakness because these muscles, the way that they're designed, will start to just overwork. And the ones that are like phasic muscles, they're prone to lengthening, becoming weakened and never really firing even when they're supposed to. So example would be in a bridge where the glutes aren't firing and the hamstrings take over. So the hamstrings be more of on a tonic side of things, and the glutes are on the phasic side. So even though it's an exercise primarily for the glutes, the hamstrings still their work. All right. So the only time this sort of concept that falls apart is with hypermobile people, because usually they have so much mobility. And they're usually prone to much more severe joint problems as a result, but they're almost phasic. Their tonic system doesn't work anywhere near as effective as it would with majority of people. All right, so that's one thing you just have to keep in mind sometimes, and for that reason hypermobile people make things look good, so that you can't really see anything wrong with it, but they'll tell you that it's hurting them even though it may look good. All right, so because they're not very good at stabilizing. All right, so as we've just gone over, tonic muscles prone to shortness, and they're more concerned with stabilizing and posture, working for long periods of time, usually made up of primarily slow twitch fibers, and they're easily facilitated with repetitive movements. That's why they always end up with trigger points and pain. On the flip side, the phasic muscles are prone to weakness and inhibition, more concerned with fast and powerful movements. So example being glutes again in the hips. And serratus anterior for the shoulder, so which is like really activated with boxes and powerful movements like that. So they're predominantly fast twitch fibers and require specific movement to keep them fully functional and strong. All right, so these ones are usually always the problem that keeps chronic pain running. These ones are the ones that need to be toned down. All right. So if you go back to this, so you can see everything on this side are usually the ones associated with trigger points and severe stiffness. All right, so pecs in the shoulder, piriformis in the hip, TFL in the hip, rectus femoris for your quads, hamstrings, everyone, the calf muscle, these are adductors, so these are all upper traps of the shoulder, all of them. All right, these ones are always associated with weakness. So, but it's really these ones that are the key to unlocking everything. You can regain the strength, and there it turns these ones down. All right, the hard part is how do you do that without turning them up, and that's where it gets messy. All right, so compensation escalates when the tonic muscles, by way of their design, just continue to overwork dominating all the movements, basically stealing the work from the muscles. So as we mentioned before, you could have the right exercise to correct it, but the tonic muscles are completely ruining it. So this just further creates the imbalance further, and and the muscles are not capable of being able to perform their tasks. So trigger points are inevitable. Which then just makes everything weaker, and everything just goes off the rails. So a good example here would be back pain, where people try to strengthen their core to try and improve their lumbar spine stability, which makes sense, but it's pointless if you're not addressing the hip stiffness, because the hip stiffness is going to completely sacrifice anything you've done. So if I've been able to maintain neutral because my hips are mobile to be able to bend over like this, then my core efforts are probably good, because my hip mobility was addressed first. But in this case, my hip mobility wasn't addressed, so it won't matter what core exercises I do. The minute I bend over, I'm just going to completely release all of that stabilising to enable me to get to the full range of depth that I need to when I bend over. Otherwise, I could maintain my neutral position by never bending over fully, but that means I can't tie my shoes up. So can you see how this is always going to be compromised by the mobilising structure first? All right, and once I get, and which could be actually partly to do with the strength within the gluteal muscles creating the stiffness. So it's sort of like the byproduct of the weakness, but now that's creating another problem. So you're going to have to correct the weakness, you have to address the stiffness first. All right, so this is where you'll sort of follow this sort of pattern of mobilising, stabilising, strengthening. So if you're working on a plan improving the hip mobility first, such as the 90-90 stretch, and then stabilising and then strengthening, you'd go a long way to getting rid of your problems. So using it, this is where the joint by joint helps you, because now you can start to use advantage, to take advantage, to leverage each joint's specific role by putting the system back together with the way it was meant to work in the first place, and then lastly integrating it so that it works correctly. So it's to be mobilising the hip, maybe strengthening the core through some of the obliques and a bit of glutes in this one as well, and then integrate it back into the bending action of the deadlift so that you bend correctly instead of the poor way, and around you go in that sort of order. So if we look at each joint from the ground up as we did at the beginning, and we just break it down for you, and these are all videos on my channel, by the way. These are all videos you can go and look up if you want to. So if I'm looking at the foot, basically you want to start there, because any movement you do standing up, the neural signaling begins at the feet. It's the first part of the body to tell the rest of the joints what they're going to need to do in a second, because your brain doesn't know what the surface is like for it to tell all the other joints what to do. So that's why I have a lot of nerves underneath your feet, because they almost become like a second brain. So they tell you how much pronation is going to be needed, and how much you're going to need to interact with the other joints to counter that, or vice versa if there's not enough, and so forth. All right, so the stronger and more stable the feet are, the better your chances of preventing problems in the rest of the legs it will be. All right. Unfortunately, a lot of people have very weak feet, so hence you'll see a lot of problems come about through the hip and the knee, because those two joints are greatly compromised by what's going on. The ankle usually develops stiffness because of the weakness of the feet. All right. So these are videos where I give you simple foot drills. There's more sort of integrated ones of balance beam stuff, and then another integrated one where you see issues coming at the knee and the hip, but were really created by the feet. So they're great videos. Check the link in the description below to see these articles and videos that go into more detail for these. The ankle, so dorsiflexion is something we all tend to take for granted, and trust me, if you work with anyone with walking impairments, you'll know how hard it is to walk when your foot doesn't have enough ankle mobility. So basically every time you squat, you lunge, almost do anything with your legs, you need a fair degree of ankle movement to be able to control motions and get the body moving in a way that you need it. The loss of dorsiflexion in the squat is specifically a real big problem with quadriceps weakness and things like that, and you can see in these videos here, here's an ankle drill, mobilizing and then trying to integrate it into the squat. This is a real effective one at using a band to enhance the stability of the joint so you can work on the mobility, and this video just gives you a few other different simple drills you could use. But yeah, a real problem area that compromises a lot of problems at the knee, this one, and again could be a byproduct of the weakness of the feet. The knee, obviously one of the most injured parts of the body, and as we spoke about, needs a fair degree of stability. So while it does have the ability to create some small degree of rotation, really hates it, really hates being twisted, and that's when it's excessively twisted or bent sideways, which is known as valgus and varus, or hyperextended. That's when you see the horrible injuries like ACL tears, meniscus tears, patellofemoral pain. All those problems that we see are really caused from rotation of that joint, where it's rolling inwards or outwards, and just really destroying, and eventually osteoarthritis, so you end up with horrible, where you see knee replacements and that, because the cartilage is completely worn away from this constant lack of stability at the knee. Again, like the ankle plays a big part in this, as does the hips, as we're about to see. So you can see how the joint by joint thing starts to come into play here, and how your choices of exercise are really different. So I'm really looking at stabilizing things where I'm really looking at mobilizing things here, and vice versa, stabilizing stuff there. All right, so you can start to see how these things really come into it. The hip joint is quite an interesting one, a bit like the shoulders in a way, because it can be both immobile and unstable, which sort of sounds counterintuitive or contradictory, but this can result in knee pain from the instability. A weak hip will allow the internal rotation and duct into the femur, but it will actually still present as stiff, even though it's weak, because stiff doesn't mean necessarily strong. So, how does it? It sort of seems weird. How can it be both immobile and unstable at the same time? But very often it is. So my thoughts are that at first it develops the stiffness from inactivity from sitting too much and repetitive actions that are poorly executed, and then eventually develops the weakness from that instability, and creates like stiffness in an area that you don't want it, usually being the anterior part of the hip. All right, so people who are sitting in a posterior tilt, really stiffness through the glutes, but have almost too much mobility at the front, that ends up letting the joint come forward and out of the socket, more or less. So always remember that the stiffness is the byproduct, and so in terms of the way the body sees it, the stiffness is absolutely necessary in a way to protect itself, because you're not changing the way you move. You're not enhancing the stability by doing anything about it, so all it can do to prevent further destruction is to create stiffness, which means you lose a lot of movement and strength as a result. So generally speaking, the hips benefit from increased mobility, just for its tendency to become very stiff, usually from our sitting and things that we'll do. If the hip loses mobility, it will affect the role of the joint complex above and below. So again, we'll see lots of knee problems, and in this case we'll see lots of lumbar spine problems, because of the lack of mobility forcing the spine to overextend on itself. All right. So moving to the lumbar spine, this usually takes a lot of attention for core exercises for a good reason. So trying to sort of activate and strengthen the abdominal wall. But the way that we should train them should line up the structure of the lumbar spine and avoid excessive lumbar flexion. That's why sit-ups and that are terrible, because they're very much compromising the stability of the spine in order to strengthen, which absolutely makes no sense, as it does with rotation. So any repetitive exercise that encourages too much movement of the spine will create more instability and be a problem more than a help. So these are good videos that I've given here that are all slightly different. They give you different examples of how that is in simple variations, floor-based exercises, and then also integrated ones where the core is functioning as an anti-movement muscle as opposed to providing movement. So a very important part of a very highly damaged area. So again, the hips are a huge role here, as we saw earlier, as is the thoracic spine, which we'll look at now. And a big part of this is the way that the each part of the vertebrae is designed. So as you can see, the lumbar spine vertebrae is designed differently to the thoracic and the cervical spine. And basically what this means is this segment, your thoracic spine, because they're designed like this, they're actually able to really rotate and move around, as is the cervical spine, but the lumbar spine is not. It really has a much more wider, more levers to make it more stable, which means it can't do rotational things. It's when it's forced into it that it creates trouble, but really it should have come from here. And usually the stiffness develops here from sitting, too much rigidity in the spine, and just poor exercise movement in general where it's not used enough. So then, because it's not mobile enough, it looks for extra mobility in places it shouldn't get it. And you'll see in the cervical spine where you'll get excessive lordosis in this, to where the head, from forward head postures and things like that, where the thoracic spine has become too rigid and stiff in kyphosis. So lots of problems come about from this one, and very rarely is it in pain itself. The pain is at the neck or the lower back, but it's a big part of the reason for it. So in these videos here, I give you some good examples of some tests and exercises you can do to provide the two critical movements of extension of the rib cage and rotation of the trunk. And these things are used in like walking, throwing a ball, everyday movements that we make all the time. The scapular shoulder gets really messy because this joint is like very unique in that it really is just sort of sitting in mid-air, you know, where all the other joints sort of lock into each other. This is the only one that doesn't. I would say the scapula is more, when it loses its mobility, the shoulder suffers as the end result by sacrificing its stability, leading to the impingements and rotator cuff tears. But it's a hard one because at the same time it does need a fair degree of stability. All right, so this is where it does sort of get a bit, you have to really have that's why the shoulders are one of the hardest to work with, because it's just so many muscles influencing what really could be going on. It's hard to determine which is which. But at the end of the day, if the scapula doesn't move with its full range of motion of upward rotation in particular, you're always going to encounter trouble. So more stability than mobility is where there is more movement at the shoulder joint than any other joint. So it can basically get into about 1,600 different positions. So that's sort of, you know, saying to you, okay, well, it's got the ability to do that, but it really needs to be controlled. So, you know, because of the way it's designed, it's really highly exposed to vulnerable positions. So the extreme ranges means it comes at a big price. So that's why I'll probably edge towards more stabilizing at times. Well, it's certainly a joint that has a lot of mobility. Its main weaknesses in areas like serratus anterior, lower trapezius, even the upper trapezius, so which you'll see a lot with neck pain. Develops a lot of trigger points in the shoulder, more so than any other area, just because of the muscles are smaller, like the rotator cuff muscles are tiny as opposed to the muscles in the hip, which are quite large. So it really develops spasms and trigger points more than just muscle stiffness and shortened range of motion. The cervical spine, you know, very much concerned with stability. It's very much like the lumbar spine, but it does have a lot more movement than the lumbar spine. So you really do still need to work on mobilizing stuff as much as stabilizing. Most people concentrate all their efforts on trying to stretch it, but I've found that's usually very ineffective over the long term. It's usually the weakness in the muscles, especially under the chin, the hyoid muscles. They're usually very, very weakened. The levator scap and the scalenes and those ones, they're usually over-facilitated and working too much, creating problems. But again, that's a protective thing, and really just to keep the eyes horizontal. So again, as the terms the body sees it, it's absolutely necessary, even though it's causing a loss of movement for you. So these are good videos where I look at mobilizing the C7-T1 junction, a series of exercises to develop strength into the upper traps and in the areas that have become weak, and then basic exercise for under the chin like I just spoke about. Alright, so lots of things that are different, so you can see it's completely different to say the thoracic ones where they're mainly mobilizing. Alright, so everything's sort of an opposing sort of role. So in summary, it seems like a lot to remember, but really the takeaway thing from this is two things. So do I want the area that I'm looking at to move with more range or mobility, or do I need it to become more stable? Second to that is, have I assessed the joints above and below it that could be compounding the problem in the first place? So if I keep these things in mind, it helps me to really get a clearer gauge as to what is really going on and become more targeted and specific as to what's going to help me, as opposed to having a wide sort of selection of things and thinking, oh, I hope it works. You eventually get a lot more clearer on what you need to do, and you'll see how from person to person it can vary. It's not always the same, but the possibilities are very similar in some regard. It's just the specific one that they needed most was the big difference. All right, so anyway, I hope this helps you, because I brought up this concept many times. I never really did a video explaining how I might use it. Hope I didn't ramble on too much. Again, check the description below, because it'll give you a lot more information that goes into more detail of some of the exercises I only just looked at. All right, so you can, if you know what you want to work on, you can go straight to that and see how I do it. All right. Any questions, comments, feel free to leave them in the below, and I'll get back to you if I can. And check out the website if you want specific things for shoulders, backs, knees, hips. They're all there. You can check it out at the website. All right. Other than that, I'll see you on our next video.